Hope you are filling the forms. So my name is Ashwin, Ashwin Pandey. I am working as a senior clinical fellow in infectious diseases at Great Ormond Street Hospital. I have been here since last 4 years, and hence it becomes very important for us who are in such career pathway, where to find out what's important and how we can progress. And if we can't do the formal training, then what are the other options? So hence we have our first speaker, Elizabeth, today, who will be covering who's representing GMC, and will cover national overview and context and future pathways. Elizabeth Swatkins, she is head of specialist applications at the General Medical Council and has responsibility for the specialist and GP registers. Elizabeth has a long history of regulation previously, because she was working for Offset before joining the GMC in 2012. She was born and brought up in Manchester, and Elizabeth calls Charlton as her home, where she lives with her family, partner, and her 2 boys, who must be keeping her busy. May I please request Elizabeth to start the session?
Thanks so much for the warm welcome. I'm absolutely delighted to be here and support the Soft Landings initiative and give an overview of the CESR process. So I'm going to, for me, the difficult bit is getting the slides up. So bear with me whilst I do that, and I'll take you through these. So hopefully that looks like a lovely slide show for you. So as I say, just got well, there's quite a few slides, but I won't linger over them too much. I am here for questions at the end. Really happy to take any of those at the end if there's anything that I don't answer. But I really just wanted to give a bit of an overview of the CESR process, and as Ashwin said in his really warm welcome, so thank you for that, Ashwin. I'll give a bit of a flavour about what the future might look like in this space as well, which is quite sort of hot off the press stuff, which hopefully is helpful. A little bit about my team and what we do. So the specialist applications team at the GMC are responsible for all of the applications to the specialist and GP registers. So that includes awarding of CCTs at the end of approved training, but also CESR and SEGPA certificates. We also do some other administrative activities around those processes, so producing verification or answering verification requests, producing duplicate certificates. We also deal with appeals against our decisions to not grant specialist or GP registration, and also the applications for doctors to spend time out of programme in approved training. So a little bit about the legislation that governs our process, which is, I won't go through it in detail, it's outlined on the slide there for you. The reason why we mention the legislation is it's a bit of a challenging area for us. So the legislation is quite old now, and it's very detailed and very prescriptive, and it's meant that we haven't really been able to move and progress our applications processes as we would have liked. So for quite some time, we have been campaigning to the Department of Health and Social Care to actually amend the legislation that governs the CESR SEGPA process. And over the last year or so, we've had really good engagement on that, and we are progressing some changes. We hope to some of the secondary legislation that governs our process, namely the PMET order. And we are hopeful to be able to introduce some new pathways to the specialist and GP register. So for those of you who already know, or you may already be aware, there are a number of options about how a doctor could demonstrate competency to join the full register and gain a licence to practice. Unfortunately, because of this very prescriptive legislation, that's not the case currently for specialist and GP registers. And essentially, unless you've completed approved training or you have the benefit of holding one of the recognised European qualifications, essentially the CESR SEGPA process is really the only way of demonstrating competency to join the registers. And we know that CESR SEGPA is a lengthy, expensive and rather burdensome process. And so we're really keen to make some changes in this area to introduce some new pathways, but also realise some changes to CESR SEGPA and make that a more flexible and accessible route. I am today going to talk in detail about CESR because that is the current main pathway to the specialty GP register, as I say, unless you've completed approved training or hold an REQ. So we're not in a position yet to share detail about the new routes, other than just to really flag that there's lots of work happening in that space, and we are hopeful about introducing new routes in the future. But if you're considering making an application just now, more detail on the CESR process is probably most helpful. So what's the CESR? It stands for entry for Certificate of Eligibility for Specialist Registration. So if anybody wondered, that's what the letters stand for. And as I've explained, it's the route for doctors who haven't followed a full training programme in the UK. So the current standard of assessment is equivalent to the UK CCT curriculum in the specialty that you're applying in. And it is an entirely evidence-based application process. So evaluators at the Royal College of Faculties don't benefit from knowing you, working with you, and so they can only make recommendations based on the evidence that's placed before them. What CESR isn't, and this is really important to say, is any assessment or comment on competency in your current role. As I say, the doctors won't necessarily, the evaluators, the clinical evaluators, won't necessarily have any of that information. They are simply making recommendations and judgments based on the evidence before them. It is, as I say, an evidence-based process, and so not based solely on the recommendations that are made by your colleagues, although there is a place for that in the process. So this slide is really just giving a flavour of the volume of applications that we receive in the CESR pathway. And as you can see, overall, it's been a growth area for us, and we're seeing significant numbers of applications on a yearly basis. Much to my surprise, the applications have not dropped off over the course of the pandemic. Slight reduction in 2021, which is perhaps to be expected, but not significant. And we're seeing similar volumes year to date for this year. So if you do decide to make an application, you are keeping good company. There's lots of doctors already engaging with this process. And this slide is really just giving a flavour of which specialties or colleges the applications are drawn from. So perhaps unsurprisingly, two big federation colleges of JCST for the surgeons and JRCPTB for the physician specialties make up the bulk of, or are the two biggest colleges who receive applications in the CESR process. But as you can see, paediatrics not too far down the list, so significant numbers of CESR applications made in the paediatric specialties. So if you are making an application in paediatrics, there are eligibility requirements that would need to be met, and this is not an indication of whether or not your application will be successful, but is essentially the first part of the process or the first consideration that we would make when looking at your application. And that eligibility requirement is 6 months continuous training in the specialty in which you're applying, or holding a specialist medical qualification in the specialty that you're applying. If you don't, if you're not able to make or meet this eligibility requirement and you do still make an application, we will not be able to proceed or support the application, and it will be withdrawn for you. This is not, like I say, a decision that is a commentary on whether or not you would ultimately be successful. If you're able to provide evidence that meets the eligibility requirement, you would absolutely be able to make a further application. Paediatrics is one of the colleges that actually receives quite a high volume of applications in non-CCT specialties, largely because you hold quite a lot of subspecialties in your area. So if you're thinking of making an application in one of those specialties, the eligibility criteria is different. So in order to make an application in a non-CCT specialty, it would be 6 months of continuous training in any non-CCT specialty. But that must have been undertaken outside the UK, or a specialist medical qualification in any non-CCT specialty. But again, that qualification would need to have been gained outside the UK. This is just one of those details of the legislation that we're having to adhere to, but there is the two different eligibility requirements, depending on whether you're applying in a CCT or non-CCT specialty. So just getting into a bit of further detail about the application process. and what it starts to look like. And I will focus on each of these areas in a little bit more detail, but this overview is just helpful in terms of giving an idea around the timeframes involved. And just important to say that this is really indicating from, as it shows, where the application is received with us. Applications can be opened in our GMC online system whilst individual doctors are working on their application for up to 12 months. So we know that there's lots and lots of work that happens before we actually receive your application. But once it is with us, this is the process that it would go through. So there are a number of milestones along the way, and we do have an SLAs for each of those stages, and that's essentially just to make sure that the process is running as efficiently as possible, and that you're seeing really good progress and timing towards ultimately a decision. The legal deadline, so lots of the other SLAs that we have in place are, as I say, kind of self-imposed, really, to make sure that we're progressing your application quickly and that real attention and focus is given to it. The legal deadline is in the section at the end, and actually that's, as I say, exactly what it says in the tin. It's a deadline that we need to meet that's defined within the legislation. So from us sending the application to college, which is sort of towards the final stage of the process for us, we have 3 months from that point to issue a decision to you. And it just just those 2 endpoints there, just give an indication about how that 3 months is split between the time that the college have to work on the application, produce an evaluation and any recommendations to us, and then the time that we spend on quality assuring, seeking any clarifications before we're then able to make a decision. It's probably appropriate at this point just to give an indication as well that there have been challenges around meeting these deadlines and SLAs. So, and this is largely due to the pandemic. And so, as you'll probably appreciate, clinicians from all the Royal Colleges and faculties have been under huge pressure in terms of their main clinical core roles. And that's really reduced their ability to evaluate for the college in the CESR process as frequently or as quickly as they would have done perhaps before the pandemic. And equally, we faced operational challenges in terms of high turnover of staff and so on. So that has meant that there is a delay at the beginning of the process before your application is allocated. That's currently about the 4-week mark, but we're making really significant progress in reducing that down, and we're expecting the backlog to be resolved in the next 4 to 6 weeks. But just in case anybody is on the cusp of making their application, just to be really transparent about where we're at in that regard. But equally, we have faced challenges in terms of issuing timely decisions in relation to the 3-month deadline. And we're working really hard with all Royal College and faculty partners to improve the timeliness of that process. So if you are thinking about making a CESR application, how do you do that? So the first stage is opening an account in our GMC online system if you don't hold one already, as all applications are made via GMC online, and all evidence is uploaded electronically. There's a small amount of evidence that we would need to see in hard copy, and I'll talk about that in a bit more detail shortly. As I stated earlier, we expect that once you open an application with us, you'll submit within 12 months. We won't automatically close the application as long as there is activity happening on the application. And if we're approaching the 12-month deadline and actually you haven't submitted, we will reach out to you to ask whether or not you need further time, and we can extend that slightly for you if that's helpful. The fee currently for making a CESR application is £1,727. So it is not an insignificant sum, and we absolutely recognise the administrative and financial burden of taking on a CESR application. So it is a consideration to make. Dependent on when you are making your CESR application, do check back at our website just to make sure that that is the current fee amount, because they are reviewed each April. As I mentioned, there is a small amount of evidence that we would require to be submitted in hard copy, and we'll make that really clear in the application process to you. But it's essentially any registration certificates or qualifications that you gained outside of the UK. We would want an authenticated copy of that. So we don't want the original, and we absolutely don't want that. That's very precious. You need to keep that with you. But if we could ask that you get an authenticated copy. So that's where a solicitor or the awarding body themselves sign and stamp a copy of the original to certify that it is a true copy of the original. And then you send that certified copy into us when invited to do so. So just a few comments really, I suppose, and guidance around some other sort of discrete aspects of our process that are worth a mention. As I say, it's an evidence-based process, and all of the evidence that's supplied does need to be verified. So there is full guidance on all of these processes on our website. You can provide links. They're in the slides at the end if you want further detail. But essentially, the way that the process works is we would ask you to find a verifier, so just one single verifier for each institution that your evidence is drawn from. So if, for example, you wanted to provide evidence drawn from 3 different institutions or 3 different posts in 3 different hospitals, you would need 3 verifiers. Each of those, so you would complete a pro forma detailing all of the evidence that the verifier is going to attest to, and that would be included in a pro forma. You would ask the verifier to sign that form, and you would send that and provide that as part of your application process. Now, when we are reviewing your evidence, we will create a sample of evidence from each of the institutions that the evidence is drawn from, supply that to the verifier and ask for them to attest that is, it's primary source verification. We're just asking them to verify with us that is the evidence that they originally signed off on the pro forma. And essentially that completes the PSV process. That was a whistle-stop tour. So as I say, there is full guidance on the website in terms of how the PSV process works and what would be expected of you. So this is really just explaining in detail what I've just said. So a couple of do's and don'ts around the pro forma. So it's really, really helpful to make sure that when you upload your evidence, the document description, the way that you describe the document, in the pro forma matches the title of the document when you upload it. So it's really easy for your advisor to be able to find the evidence that you're referring to in that pro forma. And that's particularly the case if it's you've drawn evidence for a number of organisations. Do make sure that you add the document type. Again, very helpful in terms of us identifying the documents. So it's PDF, Excel, or so on. And give the specific document dates and page numbers. As I mentioned before, it's not helpful to provide more than one pro forma or verifier per hospital. Your advisor will come back to you to ask that you nominate just one person to be a verifier per institution. It's unhelpful if the document description in the pro forma doesn't match with the title of any of the documents. It makes it very difficult to identify them. And again, giving broad range of dates and collective page numbers, it makes it very, very challenging for the advisor to make sure that in terms of the sample of evidence that they create, that they send to the verifier for checking, they want to make sure that that's as accurate as possible, just so that the PSV process runs as smoothly as possible. Anonymisation of evidence. Again, there is full guidance on the website available about anonymisation and how we expect that to happen. Essentially, as you'll appreciate, for patient confidentiality, all patient identifiable information must be removed from the evidence that you supply as part of your CESR application. If you've supported any trainees, you've examined it all, any details around the trainees must also be removed. However, reference to colleagues can remain, that's not an issue unless it's in relation to a complaint. Some patient details can remain, such as gender and date of birth, but ultimately we just need to make sure that there isn't anything like patient numbers, names, addresses, and so on that would make them identifiable. We also ask as part of the CESR application process that you provide some structured reports, and these are essentially references, and we ask for between 4 and 6 references to be supplied. And the purpose of these is they're secondary evidence, but they are helpful in terms of kind of adding some more context and information to the primary evidence that you would have supplied as part of the application process, and that's helpful to the evaluator to triangulate your evidence. Your referees must be able to comment on your current or recent practice, and most importantly, the breadth of your practice. A minimum of the 2 referees should be working in your specialty, and your primary referee must be your current clinical or medical director. We also ask for a CV. And unfortunately, although I'm sure you all have up-to-date CVs ready and to hand, it does need to be provided in our GMC format. Again, there is details on the website about how that needs to look. So please do ensure that it is provided in the GMC format. This is a very common area where we do need to go back to applicants because they've perhaps provided an up-to-date CV, but not in the correct format. And that makes it quite challenging for evaluators. So we do need to go back on that. And essentially that just sorting that out just slows down the progress of the application. The reason why it needs to be in GMC format is it must match the application, which again is helpful for the evaluators. And the way that it's structured in terms of your employment history, you start with your most recent post and work backwards from that point. We do ask that any gaps in your employment are detailed. So anything over 28 days, we would need to understand about that gap. And it's an opportunity to provide further details around research or audit, training and teaching, any management experience or particular procedures. But again, full details on the website around the format that we require for the CV. So before we get into a little bit more detail around the various parts of the process, just a few pointers about things to do before you apply. We create specialty-specific guidance for every specialty in conjunction with the Royal College. And this really is in conjunction with the curriculum, your Bible. It outlines all of the parts of the curricula and the types of evidence that we would expect to see uploaded to demonstrate competency in those areas. So absolutely make sure your specialty specific guidance is to hand. You've got the most up-to-date version, and please do consider that in conjunction with the curriculum in your specialty. Please don't duplicate evidence. CESR applications are by their very nature large, and so adding evidence more than once really does inflate the size of the application, and it makes it quite challenging for evaluators. The online application process in GMC Online will direct you that if there is evidence that you're uploading that is relevant to more than one part of the application, that you're able to cross-reference. So the evaluator is very clear where the evidence is and in which areas you would like for them to consider. Please make sure that all of the evidence that you supply is relevant and current. They are, as I say, by their very nature, large applications. So we would be expecting a typical CESR application to be between 800 and 1,200 pages. So if the size of your application is significantly less than that, it is likely that you have not provided sufficient evidence or spoke to all parts of the curricula. Equally, if you are, quite far over 1,200 documents, it's possible that you've perhaps duplicated evidence or provided evidence that isn't wholly relevant to your application. So please do look carefully at that. And finally, as I mentioned, evidence does need to be anonymised. And again, that's an area where there are redaction issues, redaction has been missed, or equally the redaction hasn't been permanent, and we've had to delete that evidence, go back to the applicant and ask for them to redact it properly and re-upload it. It does have an impact on how quickly your application can progress. So I think I've already touched on this very briefly, just about primary and secondary evidence. All applications are a mixture of primary and secondary evidence, and your SSG will direct you to that. It's important to bear in mind that in an application, more weight is given to primary evidence. If you have insufficient primary evidence in an area, it is not possible to make up for that in terms of a higher volume of secondary evidence. So just bear that in mind in terms of how you approach the evidence that you're providing across the curricula. And the slide there is just really kind of describing types of primary evidence and equally examples of types of secondary evidence. As I mentioned, all of the evidence that you provide in your CESR application is provided electronically. It needs to be readable in appropriate format. There is a large number of formats that are acceptable, but not every format that electronic evidence may be in can be uploaded. So again, there is guidance about uploading evidence on our website. So if you're having any difficulties, just check that it isn't a format issue. It must be correctly rotated. So if it's read in landscape, it needs to be uploaded in landscape. And equally, any blank pages that you can see in there, please do delete them. Again, they're big applications. Let's be kind to our evaluators and keep it as slick as possible. The different types of evidence should be grouped together. And for each of the group of documents that you upload, there should be an appropriate and matching pro forma. We do accept a range of file types, as I mentioned, but on the whole, PDFs are probably recommended, really, just in terms of ease of upload and managing them within the system. Oh, there we go. So there's a bit more detail about the various stages of the process. So as I say, make your application via GMC online. You will immediately, when your application is assigned, you will get your own applications advisor who will stay with you throughout the entire process, unless they leave or anything like that. You will have one advisor all the way through the process who will be able to advise and guide you throughout your CESR journey. The initial assessment will be made within 5 days, and that's checking the eligibility requirements that I spoke about earlier. Once that eligibility requirement has been met, we will reach out to your referees to start the process of them completing and returning to us the structured reports. And we will also contact your verifiers to ask them to open a GMC Connect account if they don't already have one, because that's how we will supply the evidence to them for verification. Once we've got through that initial stage, your applications advisor will set about assessing all of the evidence that you've provided. And they have 30 days to do that. So they'll go through all the evidence provided and indicate to you whether or not that evidence has been accepted, if there's any areas where they notice there are deficiencies, or if perhaps there's areas of the curricula where the evidence that you provided is just too old to be considered current and helpful in terms of your application. And we say generally that evidence should be drawn within the last 5 years to speak to current competency in that area of the curricula. So full advice will be given around the evidence that you provided. And we have 30 days to do that. We'll then go back to you to basically advise what that evidence looks like in the checklist, and you've got an opportunity to make any corrections. So for example, if there's any redaction issues that we found, or if there's any areas where there were deficiencies and you had evidence that you could provide to speak to those, you've got the opportunity to upload further evidence for that. We try to make this process as slick as possible. It may be that you have 1 or 2 checklists provided. Sometimes there can be 3 or 4. It just depends on the quality of the application, and essentially from our point of view, we want to be as thorough as possible to give you the best chance of success as possible. So please do consider any advice and guidance given by your advisor very carefully. But of course, the more checklists there are, the longer the process will take. We will, the final part of the process is completing the primary source verification that we spoke about, and then producing a bundle of evidence to go to the Royal College of Faculty for review. And again, there's an indication there of the timeline involved in that. So we're into the 3-month deadline part of the process, which we spoke about before. And as I said, the clock starts ticking once we upload your application to the Royal College for evaluation. Minimum of 2 clinical evaluators will assess your evidence and give recommendations to us. So they may recommend to grant specialist registration, although the decision to do that does lie with the GMC. If the Royal College of Faculty recommends that we don't offer specialist registration, they will include in your evaluation document a suite of recommendations where it details what deficiencies there were in the application and gives an indication of how those may be addressed. Once the evaluation document is back with us, we will go through it, making any clarifications, seeking any further evidence or advice that we need from the Royal College to enable us to make and issue the decision. So this is an indication across all specialties and all application types, so first full CESR applications and review applications, what the success rate looks like. So as you can see, we've made some progress in terms of success rates overall, but still work to do. This isn't, however, an indication of an individual applicant or application's possibility of success. That really is about the evidence provided and engagement with the SSG curriculum and the process and advice from your dedicated applications advisor. This is just giving an indication of the common specialty success rate. So as you can see there, paediatrics, it has about a 68.4% success rate based on the last full year. But again, it's based on the total number of decisions and all types of decisions, therefore, so not just first full CESR applications. So when you get your decision, what happens next? So if you are successful, specialist registration is granted, and a copy of the evaluation document will be sent to you. Again, if you are unsuccessful, you'll get a letter confirming that you've not been successful, and it also outlines your options. There are two, one of which is to make a review application. So that's a much smaller defined application based solely on the recommendations that were given to you as part of the evaluation document. A review application does need to be made within 12 months of receiving the decision on your first full CESR application, or you can choose to appeal the GMC's decision to not grant you specialist registration. You need to do that within 28 days of receiving the decision letter. Including the decision letter will be a copy of the evaluation and any recommendations which will be helpful in future applications. So that's a bit more information about the review option or appeal option. With an indication of what the various fees would be. As you can see, a review application fee is significantly less than a first full CESR application fee, and that's simply because it's a much smaller and defined application based solely on the recommendations that you received. This slide is just giving an indication of the overall success rates on review applications. So this is across all specialties. So as you can see, if a doctor makes a review application, they've got a 93% chance of being successful. And again, that's really largely because the recommendations that you receive are entirely bespoke to your application. And what it does also show is that if a doctor starts on a CESR journey, even if they're not successful on their first full CESR application, if they then go on to make a review application, it is likely that they will join the specialist register. So hopefully that's a hopeful indication. And very finally, because I think I'm conscious of I've run over, so apologies. But just finally, 10 top tips just to bear in mind. So just making sure that just be mindful about verification and anonymization of evidence. If there is any evidence that you provided that we just can't verify or hasn't been appropriately anonymized, we won't be able to provide that to the Royal College. It won't form part of your evidence bundle. In terms of meeting the eligibility requirement, this should be either your specialist medical qualification or an employment letter that details the 6-month continuous training in that specialty that you undertook. I mentioned the curricula. Please do familiarise yourself with the detail of the curricula. That is the standard the application will be assessed against. And the specialty specific guidance is also incredibly important to be looked at in conjunction with that curricula. Please don't rush to make your application. It's really important that you've got your evidence all in place and ready before you submit your application. Once you've submitted, limited opportunities outside of the checklisting process to provide further evidence. So, as I say, the application can be open in GMC online for up to 12 months. So please do take your time to make sure that you're really happy with the application once submitted. And if you are thinking that you might like to make a CESR application, do start thinking about gathering evidence prospectively for that process where you can. I mentioned about the CV, it does need to fit with our guidance and be in the format that we require. It's really important that your employment history matches your CV. I mentioned about not duplicating evidence, again, really, really helpful. And finally, as I say, you are given a dedicated applications advisor. They are experts in processing these applications, so please do heed the advice and guidance that they give you. And as promised, there are a few links and numbers there. There is a full support and guidance available on the website around the CESR process, and there's a link there should you want any more information. I'm going to try and stop sharing now. And just apologies again, because I think I may have overrun, but I hope that was helpful. I'm very happy to take any questions at the end. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. No, it was wonderful information. Like, it was an eye-opener for all of us. There are so many things involved, and many of us we don't know the entire process, and getting all the information in one place is very important for us. And when we go on site and check, like it's a sea and you just drown in it and you can't find what is important for you, and especially for all the specialties. Thank you so much for giving us this valuable information.